Okay, I think we can begin. And let me just remind you that 10 days from now, roughly 10 days, we'll have a midterm exam. And that's on Wednesday the 19th. We'll do a reviewing class next Monday, just to do it as a Q&A session. If you have any questions, bring them to the review session, and I'll do my best to answer them. And if for some reason you can't get the class or I can't get to your question, you can always post your questions to the course website. There'll be a special forum for that purpose. So we'll cover everything from the beginning of the semester up through Wednesday, that is this coming Wednesday, all the material up through social judgment and inference. And there will be about 15 questions. I haven't finished writing the exam yet. Looks like it's going to be about 15 questions, about the same size, maybe a little bit shorter than previous exams. All they'll want from you is short answers, just a couple of sentences. We'll do the trick. Don't bring blue books. And there'll be all these resources available to you. I haven't done the review session, the narrative review. Haven't updated that quite yet. I thought I should write the exam first. Although it could go the other way. Anyway, that's what we're going to be doing next Wednesday. Not this Wednesday, but next Wednesday. Okay, let's pick up more or less where we left off last time, which was with the upshot of the covariation calculus for causal attribution, which you'll remember is presented as a rational way for people to compute, actually, what the causes of various events are by taking information about consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness of various actors' behavior, feeding that into a calculus, which then outputs an attribution to the actor, to the target of the action, to the context in which the action takes place, and so on. And I go on about that because this covariation calculus is an expression of an important trend in the study of social cognition, two important trends, actually. The first one being the assumption that people are rational when they engage in activities like this, that is, that they follow the procedures of normative rationality. So what the covariation calculus is a logical, systematic set of rules that allows us to perform some important social cognitive task. The calculus specifies the kind of information it needs. It needs consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information. It specifies how that information is going to be combined, and then outputs a causal attribution. It works just fine with soluble problems when you've got consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information. And it's just another example of this general idea that rational thought generally employs something like algorithmic processes, recipes for performing various kinds of tasks that are guaranteed to reach the correct answer. But I also last time described for you certain departures from the covariation calculus: the fundamental attribution error, the self-other difference in causal attribution, and the self-serving bias in causal attribution. That seems to indicate that people depart from this normatively rational way of analysis in particular ways. So these are all departures from normative rationality. And the discovery of things like the fundamental attribution error set in motion a rethinking about social cognition in general, whereas before we had the idea that social cognition was more or less a cognitive process. I mean, some people are better thinkers than others, but the principle was that social cognition was a more or less cognitive process. Beginning about in the late 1970s, early 1980s, with the discovery of the fundamental attribution error, people began to cast that assumption into doubt, and a trend began, which some of us call the errors and bias program for social cognition, which basically argued that social cognition was so riddled with mistakes and errors and biases and other kinds of shortcomings that it's hard to think of it as any kind of rational process. Again, this trend began with the discovery of these three important departures from normative rationality. And you can see this in various important texts at the time. Here's a book by Dick Nisbet at Michigan and Lee Ross at Stanford, which really kind of began the errors and bias program, entitled Human Inference, Strategies and Shortcomings of Social Judgment. We've identified a number of shortcomings in everyday inference, shortcomings that can be traced either to people's over-reliance on primitive judgment heuristics or their inattentiveness to conventional normative considerations. Or a little bit later, Tom Gilovich, a professor at Cornell University, wrote a similar kind of book, kind of updating Nisbet and Ross, entitled How We Know What Isn't So, the Fallibility of Reasoning in Everyday Life, in which he made basically the same kind of argument, that there are these questionable and erroneous beliefs that we carry around in our heads that are basically due to imperfections in our thought processes. As I say, this idea that human judgment, especially social judgment, is riddled with errors and biases really took off, so that there developed an immense literature. Everybody who is anybody in social psychology, pretty much, published papers claiming to have identified one or another error or bias that infected human reasoning. This is a list produced by Joachim Kruger and David Funder. Kruger's at Brown, Funder's at UC Riverside. That's about 30 biases right there if you want the updated list. Just next time you've got time hanging heavy on your hands, just Google cognitive errors and you'll get a list of dozens and dozens and dozens of these that have been documented in the literature. Not just the actor-observer bias, the fundamental attribution error, and the self-serving bias. This errors and biases program so pervades the modern study of social cognition that you almost begin to think that we've embarked on what I've come to call the people are stupid school of psychology, especially in social psychology. A set of theories and articles in the literature that seem to promote one or more of a set of fundamental propositions about people that really seem to suggest that they are stupid after all. First, that people are fundamentally irrational. We don't employ algorithms like the covariation calculus, even when we have all the information that's needed to apply the algorithm. Something I'll talk about a little bit later, quite a bit on Wednesday, this idea that people are on automatic pilot, that most of our cognitive and behavioral activity is done automatically without us thinking about it too much. The idea that a lot of our behavior is almost literally unconscious, that we don't engage in any kind of conscious, rational deliberation before we think or act. Because our behavior is unconscious, we oftentimes don't actually know what we're doing, so that whatever explanations we offer for our behavior are more on the order of post hoc rationalizations than anything else. There are some theorists who even claim that it's a mistake to engage in conscious thought about things because unconscious activity is actually superior in terms of its outcome. Tim Wilson at University of Virginia is a good example of this, who argues that if we just thought a little bit less about things, we'd all get along a lot better. And then to kind of put the icing on the cake, we are so stupid about things, we don't even know how stupid we are. David Dunning, a professor at Cornell University, got the Ig Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for a paper showing that people don't appreciate their own errors and biases. So again, I may be putting it a little bit strongly here, but I'm not too strongly, and I'm doing it for rhetorical purposes. There is this trend, and it has by now permeated the study of social cognition. And when you read the corresponding the chapters in your textbook corresponding to these lectures, you'll see a pretty good example of this errors and biases program. Fisk and Taylor have pretty much adopted this program as the basis for their the textbooks. Now, if this were true, that would be interesting, but it turns out not necessarily to be true, or it turns out not to be as true as some people would think it would be, and that's kind of important too. Just to give you an example of what turns out to be a very crucial example, let's look at the literature on the self-other difference in causal attribution. The idea that people are more likely to make internal attributions for their own behavior. I did this because I'm smart or I studied hard, and external and likely not to make external attributions for the behavior of other people. So the self-other difference in causal attribution basically says we tend to make internal attributions for other people where we would make external attributions for our own behavior. And the problem, the issue here is this is presented as an error. And the question is it really an error or not? And it's not at all clear that it is. In the first place, if you think about what's different between making a causal attribution about yourself and making a causal attribution about other people, presumably you have a great deal more information about why you did something than why somebody else did something. So it's not surprising that when you explain your own behavior, you say, well, I did it because of this and this and this. When you try to explain somebody else's behavior, you just don't have any information, direct information about what the person's thought processes are. So you may just kind of say, well, he did it because he's a friendly person, or he did it because he's a helpful person. So this self-other difference turns out to be an interesting crucible about these errors. Bertram Malley, who is a cognitive social psychologist at Brown University, has recently re-examined the literature on the self-other difference in causal attribution. In the lecture last time, I presented the results of one review of the self-other difference, which took the form of what we think of as a narrative review. That is, David Watson, who's a wonderful psychologist at Notre Dame University, basically read the literature and then totaled up how many studies had found a self-other difference and how many studies had not found a self-other difference, and concluded that at least there was one self-other difference that was very salient. There was a lot of evidence for it, that attributions to the situation, attributions to the external context in which behavior takes place, are more likely to be made when people explain their own behavior than when people explain the behavior of other people. That's the fundamental self-other difference in causal attribution. But what Malley did was to go over the same literature and the literature that had been published since Watson's review with a new kind of literature review known as a meta-analysis, which basically means it's an analysis of analyses, and combined these studies in a quantitative way to try to determine, when you put all the studies together, exactly what is the self-other difference in causal attribution and how strong is it. What Malley did was to review 173 studies, and from these 173 published studies, he was able to extract a couple of scores from each of the studies that represented the direction and the strength of the self-other difference in causal attribution. So, for example, were people biased towards making personal or internal attributions? Or were they biased towards making situational or external attributions, from which he calculated an overall bias score, basically the difference between the tendency to make internal attributions and external attributions, where, this will be important in a second, a positive bias score means that people are biased towards internal attributions, that is, making attributions towards people's traits, effort, ability, things like that, things that are internal to the person. Negative scores representing a bias towards external attributions, that is, making attributions to the context, to the situation, to things like luck, and so on. When Malley plotted these bias scores for 173 studies, making a distinction between whatever bias people showed when they were making attributions about their own behavior versus whatever bias they showed when making attributions about other people's behaviors, he got a graph that looks like this. Okay, here's the midpoint. Here are positive scores, which, remember, represent a bias towards internal attributions. Here are negative scores, which you'll remember represent a bias towards external attributions. And you've got scores for self and for others. And what you can see here is this is essentially a normal distribution around 0. Okay, there is just no bias in these studies at all. Some people and some studies reveal a very strong internal bias. Other studies reveal a very strong external bias. But the vast bulk of study outcomes hug this midpoint, lean just a little bit towards internal attributions for everybody. So it turns out that there isn't a self-other difference in causal attribution. Okay, there are a couple of studies that show very strong such differences, but when you look at the literature as a whole and you combine that literature quantitatively, it turns out that the bias is vanishingly small. That's the magnitude of the bias here. You got to go out to 2 decimal places to find any bias at all. So one of the things we know that isn't so, to take a riff off the title of Gilovich's book, is that there's a self-other difference in causal attribution. It turns out there really isn't such a self-other difference in causal attribution. Okay, so it turns out that Malley also did a subsidiary analysis in which he further classified studies concerning the outcomes that people were making causal attributions about, whether they were positive outcomes, good things, or negative outcomes, bad things. And again, what you see here is that there still isn't a self-serving bias. You've got the filled-in circles representing attributions about positive events. You've got the open squares representing attributions about negative events. And what you can see again is that they hug the 0 point. People are no more likely to make internal attributions than external attributions about positive events. They are no more likely to make external attributions than internal attributions about negative events. When you look at the literature as a whole and you combine it quantitatively, you just don't see this bias at all. Yeah. This represents an overall bias. It's an overall bias score that combines both attributions about oneself or about other people, positive events, negative events, internal attributions, external attributions. it just turns out that people are not biased in these attributions. We thought they were early on, but they just aren't. So here, just one more point. It follows from Malley's first two analyses that there's no self-serving bias in causal attribution, nor is there a self-other difference in causal attribution. It follows from that there's no fundamental attribution error either. If there were a fundamental attribution error, we would see a lot more bias towards internal attributions than we see, and we don't. Again, these attributions tend to hug the middle. These three highly vaunted errors in causal attribution, the fundamental attribution error, the self-other difference, and the self-serving bias, they either don't occur at all, or they are not nearly as strong as they are often held to be. Malley did an interesting historical analysis as well, in which he looked at what's known as the effect size, that is, the statistical magnitude of the self-other difference in causal attribution, as a function of when the study was published. And what you see is that the very earliest studies, those that are published in 1971 to 1975, showed only a very small self-other difference in causal attribution. Beginning in the late 1970s, we got an avalanche of studies that showed really large biases, well, comparatively large biases. An effect size of 0.3 is still a pretty modest effect. But then this fell off, so that there's no bias, 1981 to 1983, jumped up again, 84 to 86, and then fell off again. If anything, what there is a little bias in the other direction. The self-other bias in causal attribution found its way into the textbooks around here in the late 1970s and the early 1980s and stuck there. Stuck there because up until Malley's review, nobody had ever actually gone back and actually reviewed the literature quantitatively to check and see if it was there. And it turns out it may have been there at one time for reasons that are kind of unclear. I mean, here's the classic study right there, not much of a self-other difference at all, jumps up and then gradually disappears. So again, what we thought we knew about attributions, causal attributions, that there are these basic errors, the fundamental attribution error, the self-other difference, and the self-serving bias, they're just not there at all. In fact, if you read this literature, if you look at this carefully, it looks as if people are doing pretty much what the covariation calculus says they should when they are put in a situation where they can apply it. But it turns out that even the covariation calculus itself has a number of problems associated with it, primarily because the covariation calculus is itself based on a misunderstanding of how people analyze the causes. The roots of the covariation calculus go back to the work of a guy named Fritz Heider. Talk to you about him a little bit last time, who was very much influenced by Kurt Lewin. And you'll remember Lewin's grand truism that behavior is a function of something about the person and something about the environment acting in combination. The covariation calculus and the studies of the covariation calculus make an implicit assumption that personal causes of behavior and environmental causes of behavior are essentially independent of each other, that you can assign some variance to the person and some variance to the environment. But we know, and we've known since Lewin, really, that that's not the case, that instead of being independent of each other, the personal and environmental determinants of behavior are interdependent. They interact with each other, chiefly because people create the environments to which they respond. And if people create the environments to which they respond, then it becomes not so easy anymore to partition the variance in behavior to that which is caused by the person and that which is caused by the environment. How do people construct their environments? First, through behavior, by engaging in overt behavioral activity that changes the character of an environment. And second, through covert mental activity that changes the perception of the environment. And you'll remember, going way back to the very first lectures in this class, that it's not the situation that causes behavior, it's a perception of the situation that causes behavior. And that perception of the situation, that's something that resides inside the person. That's something that resides inside the head of the person. So just to remind you, here's a pithy quote from Lewin as far back as 1939. The psychological environment has got to be regarded functionally as part of one interdependent field, the other part of which is the person. For Lewin, the person and the environment are inextricably intertwined with each other. And when you do things like construct a covariation calculus that basically asks people to take the two apart, to say, well, this behavior was caused by the situation, and this behavior was caused by the person, and this by the target, and this by the actor, that wasn't what Lewin had in mind at all. What Lewin really had in mind was what we have come to call the doctrine of interactionism, where people affect, influence, change the situations which go on to influence their behavior. The fundamental attribution error says that people make a mistake when they attribute causality to the person because causality really resides in the environment. The doctrine of interactionism says that's not the point. That's not true. The cause might reside in the perceived environment, in the meaning of the environment, but that meaning, that perception, actually resides in the person. So to the extent that people make causal attributions to the person, it's not necessarily an error at all. So just to review from an earlier lecture, here are the ways that people can construct their environments through evocation, selection, behavioral manipulation, and cognitive transformation. And once you accept that fundamental idea, which traces back at least to Lewin, if not to the Thomases, again, the covariation calculus seems to be not quite right. So what do we do? Okay, the problem with these analyses of causal attribution is that they rest on a false distinction between the person and the environment. If it's the perceived environment that causes behavior, and the perception is something that the person has constructed, then there isn't any distinction between the person and the environment anymore. And from a psychological viewpoint, then, it turns out that correct attributions are always to the person, because it's always the person's perception that generates the person's action in response to that perception. Well, correct attributions aren't always to the person, but as we'll see in a minute, it's important not to discount them. So what do we do? Well,